there are many legendary figures in history, most of which have shaped it to their whims. But some are so famed that they can not only save a culture of people, but reforge them in their own image altogether. Today, I would like to talk about a man responsible for the Marauders as we know them. The first of the old four, the famous Röhngard, the one who truly changed history and the future of a whole culture. Today, he is seen as a hero and a role model to those even outside of their culture. He is the father of the modern Svard people who now call themselves the Marauders. But in his younger life, he was very much a nobody. He was born the child of a nobody to have the title of nothing. In some backwater village at the edge of the Svard properties, no one expected much from him, and he might have died early on. See, his family was slain when he was very young due to a petty squabble over the land that no one really cared for, and he was forced to flee his home as a mere child. His life did not go well or expected, as he had little control over his early days. Shortly after fleeing, he ran into scoured lands, where he was almost immediately press-ganged into a mercenary company, as they wouldn't accept him for any other job. He could barely lift a sword, and nearly died in his first conflict, getting a wound across his head and his arm by a brigand almost twice his size who wasn't even aiming for him. It scarred the young boy quite a lot, but over time he survived and grew, and it was surprise to no one that he did remain ever the loner. That weird Svard boy who seemed to survive everything sent him to the front lines, and he gained a reputation for being just that. Not a fighter, but a survivor. He took his first life before he was even fully an adult. Some tales say he chopped off his head, but some are less dramatic in their retelling of the events. Regardless, he was learning to fight and growing in strength. By the time he was a man, he was doing more than just surviving most fights, and was actually beating most of his foes to a bloody pulp, if they even survived. He had the soul of a warrior through and through, and his reputation began to grow. Not that he cared, he was always the loner. He was happy for the rising coin, of course, but spent most of it wanting his own tent or room to stay in when he went to a local location. In his many travels, he was eventually put up against a Svard chieftain in single combat. It was just the young man in tattered, half-broken stolen armor versus a warlord and his blood chaser dragon, which to me doesn't really seem like single combat, but the company took it that way. He showed his skill to those around him, though, and won the battle alone. He took the armor of the chieftain and the head of the blood chaser as a trophy. They learned that there might have been something to this young boy after that event. It didn't take much longer after that event for him to become the leader of the company, as most of the predecessors died, which he accepted almost purely for the money. But he actually was a good commander, and trained his company in many ways they didn't think of before, including how to fight dragons. Mostly using formations including pikes. This is where he earned one of his names, the Pike Lord, unsurprisingly, and quite uncreatively, but you know what mercenaries are like. He eventually amassed a fortune enough to retire early. Some people were still considered in their prime when he was retiring. But he did not put down the blade, nor did he stop traveling. Alone, in a full suit of armor and an arsenal on his back, he traveled the world. And at some point, he decided it was time to get a dragon of his own. And so he set out to the south to find a blood chaser, as is Svard tradition. And he found one. A scrawny, malnourished, dying runt of the litter. He found the poor little thing alone, at the bottom of a cliff, feasting on a corpse that was discarded by a greater dragon. The poor thing was snarling at him for ages, before it ran out of energy to even do that. Röhngard took pity on the poor little thing, and started to care for it. picking it up, cradling it like a child. It had no power to even stop him. He named it Halistor, and it didn't take long for him to bond with the beast. He grew at an alarming rate too, something Röhngard was very happy about. He grew very fond of the small little beast, and in turn it grew and guarded him fiercely and loyally. They'd travel the lands for most of his adult life, building a legend, yet never staying in one place for too long. Monster hunters and mercenaries of fortune, something that might be starting to sound familiar. Until one day, he saw an orphan child of war, not too dissimilar to a younger him. They were as Svard like him, and he grew sorrowful upon the sight of them. How could this still be happening, he must have wondered to himself. His entire life, the same calamity was still facing his homeland. No one was doing anything. In fact, judging by the state of the lad, it must have been getting worse. He gave the child a home, and wandered back to his long-abandoned homeland. He feared the worst, and it was all sadly true. He saw brigands and thugs controlling the streets, weak old bodies left on the ground littering the streets, feral dragons flying overhead, burning those who came too close, and fat jarls not lifting a finger to change things in their lands, instead sending their armies to conquer more of them. But his fame had carried even here, and his words had sway even in the broken lands. He demanded a call to all those of power, and a meeting was to be held with all the chieftains, calling a ceasefire to all the wars that were happening at the time. And he got his wish, as they all gathered in a large meeting hall. Once gathered, they had their drinks and feasts, until Röhngard stood before having the audience. He made his plea about how things needed to change. The lands were dying, and it was clear to see that all these wars had naught to gain. He tried to convince them that these lands were meaningless and must be left so that their might could be combined to conquer a new home for their people, putting all of their petty squabbles behind and uniting as one. His proposal was met by a small cacophony of laughter, and his heart sunk. Was this to be the fate of his people, he feared? Death by the hand of their own stubbornness. He had half a mind to storm out the room at that moment, leaving them to their fate, were it not for another figure who stepped forward. A large man, a giant by most standards, with an enormous fur cloak and massive weapons behind his back. He towered over Röhngard, who was taller than most, and shook his head. He saw the wisdom in his words and decided to join him. The laughter stopped short after, as the man was well respected. Then another, an older man, stepped forward, bringing his clan along, and lastly a fourth, a more noble figure with quite fancy regalia, joined them. And together they were to form the Old Four. Today they are known as the forefathers of the Marauders, and the ones who saved the Svard people, as Röhngard's predictions ran true, and the land cracked open, ending those who stayed. And those who left, under the guidance of the Old Four, were all that remained of their people. Following their teachings, they changed their culture over time, to fit more of theirs. The other three members could have their own stories in and of themselves, but today I would like to finish the tale of Röhngard. Over time, the Svard people became more like the Marauders as we know them now. They turned nomadic, and into the lone monster hunters and mercenaries that keep to their own, preserving their culture, while helping and working with all others indiscriminately. The figures, we know them as now. Röhngard, as well as the other members of the Old Four, spent the rest of their lives teaching their ways to the next generation, and he grew very prideful in his old age. He looked down upon his descendants from his lone tower, watching them teach another generation of his ways, and was happy. His legacy was not that of a meaningless, forgetful mercenary, but a savior of a whole race and culture of people. And unlike most mercenaries, and even marauders to follow, he died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, friends, and loved ones, who carried his teachings with pride. The only one who took genuine pain in his death was his loyal mount, Halistor, who let out an earth-shattering scream and flew into the wilds upon hearing of the news of his master's death. He refused to accept it. He does come out every now and again to help those true to Röhngard's teachings, almost always those of Svard descent, but he is grieving in his own way, I suppose. But his legend does live on, even after his death. So, let's raise a drink and toss a coin to a marauder, the true survivors of the Svard followings, and of one man's mighty teachings. Thank you for listening to my tales. I'm the Ashspawn. Feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. But, till next we meet, fellow traveller, have a good day.